Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are mapping out what is basically the ultimate geopolitical roller coaster. We're going to track 50 years of superpower diplomacy between the United States and China, running all the way from 1972 right up through the high stakes negotiations of 2026. This relationship has literally reshaped the entire world. And by looking at the key moments when the leaders of these two nations met face to face, we can uncover exactly how we arrived at today's global landscape.
To really wrap our heads around today's tense geopolitics, we need to look at this historical pendulum through four distinct eras. The relationship has swung so dramatically. I mean, we go from cautious normalization in the 1970s to deep economic integration in the 90s, into an era of rising tensions in the 2010s, and finally landing in the open rivalry of the 2020s. So, here is our roadmap for today. We've structured this to keep us super focused on how we got from cold isolation to today's high-stakes standoff. First, the strategic opening. Second, the economic boom. Third, rising tensions and diplomacy. Fourth, the era of rivalry. And finally, a 50-year review.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the strategic opening, covering 1972 to the 1980s.
Well, everything in this foundational period really started because of a shared adversary. Back in 1972, Richard Nixon shocked the world by visiting China, which ended nearly 23 years of total distance. Then, by 1979, Jimmy Carter fully normalized relations, making the historic concession to sever formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. But the most striking image of this era, also in 1979, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping visited the U.S. and actually wore a cowboy hat at a Texas rodeo. It's such a brilliant, powerful visual of this newfound friendship. And the underlying glue holding it all together, a mutual need to counterbalance the Soviet Union.
So that strategic alignment naturally evolved into pretty pragmatic, routine business diplomacy during the Reagan years in the 1980s. But then the pendulum violently swung back. In 1989, the suppression of pro-democracy protesters at Tiananmen Square put the relationship into a deep freeze. The U.S. imposed strict sanctions and an arms embargo. And incredibly, that arms embargo remains in place to this very day. A long period of mutual suspicion followed.
Let's move to the next section and see how this builds into an era completely defined by money and manufacturing. Section 2, the economic boom from the 1990s to the 2000s.
During this time, President Clinton really pushed for China's entry into the World Trade Organization, which officially happened in 2001. For China, it was absolutely transformative. It sparked an export boom that turned the nation into the factory of the world and lifted literally millions of people out of poverty. But for the U.S., the impact was fiercely double-edged. On one hand, American consumers got access to an endless supply of cheap goods, keeping inflation low. But on the other hand, the resulting China shock of import competition hollowed out American manufacturing towns, which laid the exact groundwork for the populist backlash we see in U.S. politics today.
Despite these massive economic shifts and growing trade imbalances, the 2000s under George W. Bush actually maintained a pretty pragmatic stability. Even with early friction like the 2001 spy plane incident, mutual global needs, particularly the war on terror, kept things steady. Bush even attended the opening ceremony of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which was a highly symbolic nod to China's arrival on the world stage.
We had nearly 2 decades of deep economic integration and mutual growth, which brings up a crucial question for us. If trade was booming,
When exactly did this golden era, this global consensus of engagement, finally break down?
Section 3, Rising Tensions and Diplomacy, 2009 to 2016. Here we see the absolute peak of cooperation colliding with intense mistrust. Now, what's really interesting here is how the diplomatic language started to change. President Xi Jinping introduced the concept of a new type of major country relations. This wasn't just some catchy slogan. It was a clear diplomatic signal to present China as a fully equal global power to the United States. And it's a framework that Washington never fully accepted, which really highlighted a fundamental shift in how the two nations viewed the global power dynamic. You can literally see that push and pull in the major events of this era. On one hand, you had the 2013 Sunnyland Summit, where Obama and Xi walked around in their shirt sleeves to build personal ties. And this actually led to incredible breakthroughs, like the 2014 Joint Climate Deal that paved the way for the historic Paris Agreement. But simmering right in the background were heavy tensions. Things like commercial cyber theft, the U.S.-Asia pivot, which was a strategic shift to refocus military resources on the Indo-Pacific, and China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea. The stage was undeniably being set for a clash.
Section 4. The Era of Rivalry. 2017 to 2026. This is where the pendulum swings entirely into open rivalry. So we have now arrived at the modern era. The Trump administration began with remarkably warm personal diplomacy. Back in 2017, Xi visited Mar-a-Lago, where Trump famously recalled eating the most beautiful chocolate cake, followed by Trump receiving an extraordinary private dinner in Beijing's Forbidden City. But that personal chemistry quickly deteriorated into a massive, multi-billion-dollar trade war in 2018 and 2019. By the time COVID-19 emerged, relations plunged to their most hostile point since normalization, totally reshaping global supply chains.
When the Biden administration took over, the strategy transitioned into what they termed managed competition. And this perfectly illustrates the new reality. Biden actually kept and even expanded many of Trump's tech restrictions, like the CHIPS Act, which aggressively funded domestic semiconductor manufacturing to edge out China. The strategy was strictly framed as managed competition, aggressively compete and restrict critical tech while still trying to cooperate on shared global crises.
We saw this managed competition play out vividly at the 2023 Woodside Summit in California. It was an essential exercise in crisis management to prevent accidental military escalation. They agreed to restore suspended military-to-military communications, committed to keeping artificial intelligence out of nuclear weapon decisions, and joined forces to halt fentanyl precursors. Yet, at the exact same time, China countered U.S. tech limits by imposing export controls on critical minerals like gallium and germanium. The rivalry was becoming entirely institutionalized.
According to the timeline from our sources, this economic tit-for-tat escalates dramatically. By 2025, during a second Trump term, U.S. tariffs soar above 140%. China retaliates by aggressively leveraging its dominance over rare earth elements and magnet exports. The economic pain actually becomes so severe that it forces an October 2025 ceasefire at the APEC summit in Busan, which required the U.S. to desperately resume massive soybean imports just to stabilize its agricultural sector.
This rapid escalation leads directly to a critical turning point detailed in the source material, the May 2026 Beijing Summit. Analysts noted that because of China's absolute grip on the rare earth mineral processing required for modern defense and clean energy, the balance of influence had shifted. For the first time in the history of these relations, China entered the negotiations with what was described as the structural upper hand. Section 5. 50 years in review. So the crucial point is, how do we make sense of all this? We've mapped out a massive, sweeping journey across 11 U.S. administrations. We went from the anti-Soviet alliance of the 70s into the mutual business of the 80s, the deep integration of the 90s, the uneasy interdependence of the 2000s, right up to the tech decoupling and managed rivalry defining the present day. The optimism of engagement has entirely given way to crisis management.
And despite all the trade wars, all the tech battles, and the climate agreements, one fundamental issue looms above it all. As noted by Chinese officials during the 2026 summit, the unresolved Taiwan question remains the absolute center of the dialogue and the single most likely trigger for an actual superpower military conflict. I mean, the stakes literally couldn't be higher. Which leaves us with this final, burning thought for you to consider. In an era where clean energy and modern defense rely entirely on tightly controlled supply chains, will the fragile economic ceasefires hold? Or is open superpower conflict inevitable? It's a fascinating, sobering question. Thank you so much for diving into this explainer with me today, and keep questioning the world around you.